So, I've had this thought rattling around in my head, and I think it makes sense. Maybe it's relevant. I feel like for gamers of my generation, millennial gamers, there are two games that really define our generation specifically, and that's Dark Souls and it's Pokémon. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Mario and Zelda, but they're not ours, They were from the 80s and we just inherited them. I've enjoyed Fortnite, Minecraft. Again, I've never played Minecraft, but I'm aware of these games that the generation younger than us are into. But Pokémon and Dark Souls, those were our games. And I don't think that's a coincidence. So, there are three things I want to try and explain in this video. The first is the surprising ways that those two games are very similar. When I say those two games, I specifically mean the original Pokémon Red, and I mean the original Dark Souls. And the franchises that evolved from there somewhat, but those two specifically. So I want to share how they're similar, and then I think that there's a reason they're similar if we look at sort of the development history of them, the people who made them, and why they made them. And then the more difficult part, I want to explain why these games specifically, and why they were made and how they were made and what it is that's similar about them, why that appealed so much to me, and hopefully by extension, you. Hopefully, you'll watch this video and it will help you reinterpret your relationship with some of the media you love, and help you understand what it is that you appreciate about those things. At the very least, hopefully you'll come away from this video and go, I guess he had a point. And maybe you'll come away from this video and think, that guy's nuts, what's he on about? But, here's the thing. Part 1. Pokémon Red and Dark Souls are basically the same game. That's an exaggeration, but you have to exaggerate on YouTube. Wait, let me do YouTube face for the thumbnail. Okay, so, neither game is open world, but both games are contiguous world. What I mean is, you can take the layout of all the towns in Pokémon Red and Blue and put them together as one sprite, and it fits, it's a map, it works. And similarly, with Dark Souls, you can take Lordran, and it could be one big 3D model, and everything fits and slots, and fits together. And there have even been some great paintings expressing exactly that, There's maps of Kanto, there's maps of Lordran, and they're gorgeous. And the structure of these games, right, it's not completely open, it's not a go anywhere, do what you want, modern open world game. But it's not a linear, go forwards game. It's this middle ground, and I think that appealed to our generation for some reason. And I'm not done. There's specific ways. Not just this overall type of structure, but the way the games are structured does line up. So think about this important moment from the start of Dark Souls. You've just got onto the Undead Burg, you've battled your way through these tough enemies, you have to go through a whole boss, you finally get through that boss, and you're on a bridge and a dragon comes over, and you're thinking like, where is my moment's peace? And then you go down this little tunnel, and you kick down that ladder, and you're back at the bonfire. And that's a really key moment in the appeal of Dark Souls. That's when a lot of players, I think, myself included, got it. That's when we get it. And Pokemon Red and Blue has a, not quite the same, but a similar moment, where after you've beaten the first couple towns, you've done Pallet Town, you've gone to Pewter City, you've got your first gym badge, you go through Mount Moon, you have to hop over a ledge. And once you hop over this ledge, there's no going back. And in a traditional game, right, in a Super Mario Brothers, that's the end of the level. And you don't go back to the previous level, you're on the next level. But then, many, many hours later, you've done a few more towns, you've unlocked Cut and Dig and whatever else. You realise, oh, I can go back. And that it is all connected, and that it is a real world. And what I think that does, in the case of both games, is it creates a sense of place. I really feel like I have visited Lordran. And even before I moved to Japan, I felt like I'd visited Kanto. And then just think about that bonfire itself, and how in Pokemon you have the Pokemon Center. And every time you're battling through a tough cave and you're just barely making it out with enough health, bam, there's the Pokemon Center. Or bam, there's the bonfire. It's such a similar feeling, to the point that when you play Pokemon, I bet you like to save at the Pokemon Center. And when you play Dark Souls, even though, just like Pokemon, it's saving everywhere, I bet you want to save at a bonfire. Okay, and then, I'm not even close to done. There are even more specific examples, just while we're still on the structure of the game. Think about this moment. You've been walking on foot all over Pokemon Red and Blue. You travel to this town, all the way back and forth. And then, right when you think you've seen the whole map, you unlock the ability to fly. And suddenly all these towns on your town map, you can just fly to them anytime. And Dark Souls as well. You've been slogging through this game that the first time you play it is difficult. And then, you get the Lord Vessel, and suddenly you can just warp back and forth. And then in both cases, there's actually still a fair bit of game left to go. But you feel like you've got this upper hand now, right? I can zip there, I can zip there. The world is my oyster. And going back to that idea that they're not quite open world, but not quite linear, both games allow for a surprising amount of sequence breaking. The first couple times I played through Dark Souls, I did Quelaag before I even discovered the gargoyles. I just had no idea that you were meant to go that way around. And yeah, beating Quelaag first is a lot harder, and it meant that I never really saw the gargoyles as difficult. Similarly, in Pokemon, there's 3 or 4 gym badges in the original game. You can do in whatever order you want. You can have unlocked Erica, Koga, Sabrina, Blaine, and then you can pick which ones you want to fight. Just do it how you want to do it. And this is something which both games lose a little bit in some of their sequels, and then go back to in a big way. We'll get to that in a sec. Even more than the structure of the game, there's another element that's even more similar about these two games, and that is the element of self-expression. Now sure, at the start of Dark Souls you can create your character, and you can choose different skin tones and make your face and wiggle around with the nose. But actually most of the game, you're not even looking at that face. You're covered up with a helmet. And same in Pokemon, eventually they did introduce full character creation. But even in the first generation, you name your character, and then the way you express yourself is what Pokemon do you catch? What moves do you teach them? What's your method for getting through this game? And Dark Souls is the same, right? How do you get through the game? Do you build strength and swing a big sword? Do you learn a bunch of magic? Do you learn all these tricksy tactics using poison and putting things to sleep and bleeding things? And in both games, there's a huge range of player self-expression that you can use to get through these otherwise linear games. So although we've all beaten the same 8 gyms and eventually the Elite Four, and we've all beaten the 2 Bells and then eventually Orstein and Smo and the 4 Lords, the way we've done it is so different. And in the case of both games, this element, this self-expression, and the way that 2 characters can be so different led to the inclusion of a player versus player mode that was kind of tacked on in the original games. Both Dark Souls and Pokemon Red, it was pretty much an afterthought. But it's developed into this whole multiplayer community, and Pokemon is now has world tournaments, and I bet Dark Souls and Elden Ring are not that far behind. And then the other element of how these games are so similar is the way they exist outside of the games. So I started this video by saying these 2 games are in my head, lodged in there in a way like nothing else, to the point that I seek out so much extra content. I go and watch Dark Souls YouTube videos, I listen to Dark Souls podcasts, I watch a bunch of Pokemon YouTube videos, I listen to Pokemon podcasts, I do a Pokemon podcast. And it's because the level that you see in the game and the amount of lore buried underneath has such a wild ratio compared to almost anything else. And now the big difference is that I think Pokemon makes more of a deliberate effort to spread the lore itself, right? You have the anime and manga and various official YouTube accounts. Dark Souls has done some comic books and stuff. I think they're mostly terrible. And it's more about digging into the lore which is actually buried in the games themselves. But just think of going to Cinnabar Island and reading those diaries about the creation of Mew, or going down to New Londo ruins in Dark Souls and slowly realizing what horrible thing had happened. It's a similar feeling, and I think it's part of why these games are so lodged in the heads of so many players. And then briefly to touch on beyond these initial games, right, Pokemon Red and Blue or Dark Souls, the franchise has kind of developed in a similar way. They started as these very indie projects, and they've slowly become big tentpole releases for the relevant companies. And they've expanded in a way where sometimes they kind of hew too close to the original. Look at stuff like Dark Souls 3, or when X and Y just re-gives you the old starters. And then they've done ones where they try to go far away from the original. Interestingly, both games have in the past year or two done a Feudal Japan edition, followed by an Open World edition. And they've even started taking elements from each other. Pokemon has a dog with a sword in its mouth, a clear Dark Souls reference. And then Elden Ring has the player collecting all of these spirit creatures and summoning them for battles, basically using Pokemon. So hopefully somewhere in these disjointed thoughts, you've cottoned on to there's a connection there, right? Not a direct one. I'm not really saying Pokemon Red and Dark Souls are the same game. But I am saying they scratch the same itch. Their reasons they are appealing are very similar, even if the actual experience of playing them is, in the moment, quite different. So the original creation of Pokemon was led by a fella called Satoshi Tajiri, and he led a small games company called Game Freak, which started out originally just making a hand-printed magazine of game tips and reviews and guides. He was just immersed in the game culture, going to the arcades and drawing little graph paper images. Eventually him and his pals got into real indie development. These were guys working after school back in the late 80s, early 90s, just bashing together whatever they could. And so the legendary story goes. As a child, Satoshi Tajiri liked to catch bugs, still a popular pastime for young boys in rural Japan. But as he grew up, the area where he liked to play, the sort of greater Tokyo area, became more and more urbanized, and he started to feel that the new generation of children wouldn't have that experience of playing outside and catching creatures and exploring. And so the idea of Pokemon, there's other influences as well. It took some Ultraman sort of kaiju concepts and classic RPGs, and there's an anecdote about how Tajiri and Masuda wanted to trade items in Dragon Quest, and that sort of led to Pokemon's trading. But that childhood experience that he wanted to capture, that was the key element of Pokemon. And then Dark Souls, created by a fella called Hidetaka Miyazaki. He was, again, sort of on the periphery of the games industry. Actually, not working in games until quite a bit older than Satoshi Tajiri. But in his case, what he'd done as a child was read a lot of Western fantasy, with your fighting fantasy books and all these fantasy novels. And he, like most Japanese people, I'm an English teacher in Japan, had a pretty rough understanding of the English language. And so he could piece together these stories, but never quite. And he said that when he got older and he could read the original story, it was never quite as exciting and interesting as the version he created in his head. And that's what Dark Souls tries to capture, right? You're piecing together this world, you're doing archaeology. And if they ever came out and said, for example, no, Solaire isn't Gwyn's son, it's some character you've never heard of and he's a really hard boss, that would be lame. Because no matter how good a story it is, it's not as good as the story that feels like it's yours, that you had to create it for yourself. So both of these games were created to capture some lost childhood experience. And the other element they have in common is both games wanted to recreate that feeling of the community having to work together. For Game Freak, growing up playing arcade games in the 80s, that was the only way you could beat them, right? You'd go into school the next day and your friend got to this level in one game and you got to that level in another game, and you trade the secrets. And Miyazaki has talked about in Dark Souls, he was inspired by this experience of being caught in a snowdrift, and every car had to push the next car up the hill, and hope that another car came along to push them. And that led to this very chaotic multiplayer element in Dark Souls, and the obtuse lore that you have to, even if you're not literally playing multiplayer in the game, almost all of us play these games by talking to our pals, or listening to a podcast, or watching a YouTube. You have to share the experience. And then in Pokemon, right, there's Mew and all these secrets and rare Pokemon, right? You would never find them all by yourself, but you're not supposed to. You're meant to engage with other people. That's the whole reason there's a red version and a blue version. You have to trade to beat the game. And that brings us to the third question. Why are these games so specifically appealing to me and my generation? And I think it comes down to a sense of ownership. My generation, when we were growing up, we had stuff for us to enjoy, but it was Star Wars, it was Transformers, it was Lord of the Rings. It was my dad's stuff repackaged and resold to me. And then even outside of my childhood, my life hasn't felt like I owned it. Home ownership has seemed completely off the table. The promises of the jobs I'd be able to get when I grew up were never realised, you know? I was a teenager in one economic recession, and I'm in my 30s in a second one. Our generation doesn't feel like we have very much that's ours. We have nostalgia products that are being reheated for us, we have empty promises that were never fulfilled, and we have a world even, a planet, which is dying, right? And that's something that both Pokemon and Dark Souls touch on. Dark Souls is all about this cycle of rebirth and destruction and life, and Pokemon is obsessed with nature, mankind's relationship with nature, how it can be destructive or beneficial. And then along come these two games. And Pokemon, I was 9, 10 when I got really into it for the first time. And here was finally something that was mine. I couldn't even explain this to my parents. And I dragged them to the movie theatre and they had no idea. But everyone at school was into it. All of my friends were into it. It was ours. It was our generation's thing. And then fast forward 10 years and here comes Dark Souls. And it's a game series that, again, it's mine. And sure, it's very popular, but for everyone who got into it, it felt like you were discovering it for the first time. You were the first person playing this game. And people who haven't played Dark Souls, it's really hard to explain to them why it's good. You just have to say to them, you just got to try it. And not even try it. You've got to force yourself to play it. You've got to break through a wall to find why it's good. And then, because everyone who plays it has had to go through that process, again, we feel like we own it. We've earned it. And so these two experiences, which if you watched them for 5 minutes, couldn't seem more different, have really lodged themselves in the exact same part of my brain. To this day, I still think about, wow, where did the legendary birds come from? What's going on with Gwyn's Black Knight? These characters feel real, and they feel mine, in a way that Darth Vader and Spider-Man and Link and Mario, as much as I love them, I adore them. I've got a Zelda tattoo. They're everyone's. They're not mine. Well, I hope that made sense, and I hope it resonated with at least a few people. And if it didn't, I hope it was at least entertaining to see the bizarre way my brain works. If you want more of me rambling about how much I love Pokemon, I do a Pokemon podcast. It's called Luke Loves Pokemon. You can find it on Twitter at Luke Loves PKMN, or on Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Look it up. Every week I do a deep dive into a different Pokemon family. Again, I just wanted to listen to this podcast, and it didn't exist, so I made it. So I'm looking forward to whatever FromSoft does next. I'm expecting some DLC for Elden Ring at the very least. And I'm really looking forward to Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. And in fact, almost more than I'm looking forward to playing those games, I'm looking forward to watching the YouTube, talking to my friends, listening to podcasts, right? I've been on a kind of a blackout for Scarlet and Violet because I feel like Nintendo gives too much away in the trailers. So I'm really excited to just immerse myself in that Pokemon Online space again. And that's what Pokemon and Dark Souls does to you. You want to immerse yourself in it. You want to share it. And hey, that's what we've got, millennials, so enjoy.